You didn't simply stumble into this moment, you stepped across a kind of unseen threshold, the kind that doesn't exist in geography, but in the subtle layers of your own awareness. 1 second you were drifting through your feed the way you always do, gliding through familiar reality with familiar eyes. And then something in you shifted. A tiny impulse, a pull, a spark of curiosity nudged you to click. And in that small act, you slipped into a different level of perception without announcing it to yourself. Some traditions might call it a different realm, though it's less a place and more a frequency, a state where the old rules soften and new ones begin to show themselves. In this space, thought feels closer to form. Synchronicities gather in clusters that no longer feel like accidents but like replies. The edge between your inner world and the outer one thins until it feels almost translucent. And as you take these words in, your system is already responding. Not in dramatic fireworks, but in quiet recalibration, a subtle tuning of the field around you, as if your whole signature is adjusting to match where you've arrived. Once that settles, it becomes difficult to see reality the way you once did, not because you're locked in anything, but because recognition changes you. Once you sense a wider horizon, you can't pretend the old walls were the whole sky. The title warned you to pay attention, not because you might miss a fact, but because this moment isn't built from information. It's transmission, it's activation. It's the part of consciousness that recognizes itself beneath language and moves because of that recognition. Maybe you already feel it, that faint brightening in the center of your awareness, the quiet hum under your ribs, the sense of standing at the edge of something you can't quite define but can unmistakably feel. This is what crossing into a deeper layer of mind often feels like: gentle, steady, undeniable. Mystics across cultures pointed to this terrain. Tibetan practitioners spoke of an in-between state of transformation. Christian contemplatives described a clouded inner space where thought dissolves and clarity opens. Sufi teachers named the soft erasure of the separate self before merging into something vast. Different names, same doorway. And even some interpretations of quantum science suggest a similar idea that reality is not a rigid structure, but a shifting field of possibilities, waiting for consciousness to select which version becomes the lived one. Certain states of awareness seem to give you clearer access to those choices, in ways unavailable from ordinary perception. You might notice that the subtle shift you felt in the previous moment hasn't vanished. It lingers, almost like an echo still moving through the quiet spaces inside you, inviting you to follow it deeper. That lingering sensation is the perfect doorway into what comes next, because the feeling of being recalibrated is often the first sign of crossing into a landscape most people never realize they're already walking through. Let's step there together, slowly. There are boundaries in consciousness that don't behave like the borders on a map. They don't announce themselves with signs or warnings. Instead, they reveal themselves as changes in texture, a softening of attention, a widening of perception, a shift in how the world feels rather than how it looks. It's like entering a new room in a house you've lived in your entire life, a room you somehow never noticed, even though it was always there, waiting for the moment when you finally turned the right inner handle. These boundaries are invisible because they're built from frequency, not form. If you imagine consciousness as a vast structure, not rigid, not mechanical, but more like an architectural field made of resonance, then each state of awareness becomes a different floor, a different vantage point. The edges between these floors aren't thick walls. They're gradients. They feel like thresholds you don't walk across with your feet, but lean into with your attention. One shift of focus, one breath of presence, and suddenly you're in a different part of the internal building. Some people describe these moments as intuition sharpening. Others feel it as a strange stillness, as if the world steps half a beat out of time. Scientists might speak about state-dependent perception, the idea that your nervous system filters the world based on the level of wakefulness, emotional charge, or cognitive focus you're in. Mystics might describe the same experience as entering a subtler layer of reality. Different languages, same phenomenon. What matters is the experience itself. When you cross one of these invisible boundaries, the world doesn't transform in dramatic flashes. Instead, the shift feels like discovering a new dimension layered right on top of the ordinary. Conversations feel deeper. Silence feels fuller. Your thoughts don't just pass through your mind, they feel like ripples moving through a wider field. Even simple actions carry a kind of heightened clarity, as if you're no longer merely responding to the world, but participating in a larger choreography that's been happening all along. And here's where the architecture metaphor becomes powerful. Imagine the space you're standing in, not physically but energetically. Imagine it as a series of interlocking chambers, each tuned to a different frequency of awareness. Most people spend their lives in one chamber, believing it to be the full structure. They navigate its familiar walls, its predictable lighting, its habitual echoes. But every so often, something happens, a moment of awe, a moment of crisis, a sudden intuitive impulse, and a doorway appears in a place that used to be blank. That doorway opens into an adjacent chamber, a parallel frequency. Step through it even slightly, and the rules begin to soften. You might feel more connected to your surroundings. You might sense meaning in patterns you used to ignore. You might become aware of the subtle emotional undercurrents between people. These aren't supernatural events. They're shifts in the architecture you're tuned to. Some interpretations of neuroscience speak cautiously about this. The brain functioning in different integration states, various networks firing in patterns that change perception. Meanwhile, metaphysical traditions talk about vibrational thresholds and layers of consciousness. Both perspectives are trying to describe the same mysterious terrain from different sides of the same veil. The important part is this: you've already felt the boundary. You've already leaned into a new dimension, and that feeling wasn't imagination. It was you stepping into the next chamber. Once you learn to sense these thresholds, they stop being accidents and start becoming invitations. You begin to notice the moments when the room around you opens just a little wider, when the energy thickens, when awareness quiets enough for the next layer of the architecture to reveal itself. These subtle transitions become markers, almost gentle signposts, showing you that you're navigating not just the surface of life, but the deeper structure beneath it. And this structure extends far beyond where you stand now. The moment you recognize that the architecture beneath your awareness stretches beyond the room you've just entered, something else begins to surface, a realization that these chambers aren't static. They respond. They shift with you. It's as if the structure itself is alive, and the moment you step closer, it leans in to meet you. This reciprocity is where things get interesting, because once you sense that the inner world and the outer world are communicating in real time, you start noticing patterns you previously dismissed as random. A thought arises, and 5 minutes later the world hands you a reflection of it. A feeling changes in your chest, and suddenly the tone of a conversation shifts. You let go of an old tension, and opportunities begin to unfurl with uncanny timing. It's subtle, but it's consistent. Many ancient traditions hinted at this phenomenon, describing reality as a mirror, a dance, a play of inner state becoming outer experience. Modern psychology frames it differently, speaking about cognitive filters, selective attention, and emotional priming. Some physicists suggest that reality at the smallest scales behaves more like probability than solidity, and consciousness might influence how those probabilities take shape. Different languages, same mystery, what you resonate with. you seem to meet. Let's slow that down. Think of your internal state as a frequency broadcast, not in a literal radio wave sense, but as a metaphor for how your entire system organizes itself. When you're in contraction, everything in your perception tightens. Possibilities narrow. You interpret neutral events as threats. The world feels heavier. You feel smaller. When you're in expansion, curiosity, openness, calm, your interpretation of reality widens. You notice nuance. You catch patterns that were previously invisible. Your timing improves. You recognize opportunities instead of obstacles. The world doesn't become easier. Your ability to perceive new pathways improves. It's not magic. It's resonance. Your state acts like a tuning fork inside the architecture. Whatever matches that tone begins vibrating with you. This is why the same situation can feel entirely different depending on the consciousness you bring to it. One day, the world feels hostile, chaotic, overwhelming. The next day, without anything external changing, it feels spacious, meaningful, almost orchestrated. The difference wasn't the world. It was the frequency you were standing in when you met it. And as you move through the chambers of awareness, reality starts responding in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like conversation. Maybe you've felt this before, a sudden intuitive nudge telling you to turn a corner, call a friend, or say yes to something you normally would have postponed. You follow the nudge, and life hands you an unexpected opening that fits perfectly into your next step. Or you ignore it, only to realize later that the impulse was guiding you toward alignment you weren't ready to trust. This isn't fantasy. This is what happens when resonance becomes your navigation system. There's a moment, sometimes small, sometimes monumental, when you realize the architecture isn't passive. It interacts with you. It mirrors you. It adjusts based on the clarity or distortion within your field. When you're coherent, reality feels coherent. When you're fragmented, the world reflects that fragmentation back to you in the form of friction, resistance, or repetition of old patterns. And this reflection isn't punishment. It's information. It's feedback from the architecture. Some interpretations of neuroscience describe this as predictive processing, your brain projecting internal expectations onto the world, shaping perception with prior beliefs. Spiritual traditions describe it as energy responding to intention. Both are trying to explain why the state you bring to a moment seems to influence how the moment unfolds. The deeper truth, the one you feel beneath both explanations, is that you're not interacting with reality like a distant observer. You're participating in it. You're co-shaping it. You and the architecture are in continuous dialogue, each influencing the other. When you shift, the field shifts with you. This is why subtle internal changes can create dramatic external effects over time, not because you're bending reality to your will, but because you're aligning with the pathways already resonant with your frequency. The more coherent your inner state, the more the outer world echoes that coherence back. You might notice this in the next few days, small synchronicities clustering, conversations opening new doors, a sense of being carried rather than pushing through resistance. These are signs that resonance is becoming your guide, that the architecture is recognizing your frequency and adjusting around it. And once you sense that response, once you realize the field is listening, a new kind of responsibility emerges, not heavy, not burdensome, but empowering. You begin to understand that how you move through the chambers determines which chambers open next, and that brings us to the deeper terrain waiting just beyond this one. As the sense of resonance becomes more familiar, you might feel another realization rising beneath it, almost like a deeper current running under the architecture itself. In Section 3, you saw how the field responds to your state, but if you lean into that response even slightly, you begin to notice something even more astonishing. The path ahead of you seems to shift as soon as you do, not metaphorically, experientially. It's as if the moment you adjust your internal compass, new possibilities begin arranging themselves around you. Openings that weren't visible a breath earlier. And this is where the conversation naturally expands into something far less linear than the everyday world suggests. Because once resonance becomes part of your perception, time stops behaving like a one-way street. You've probably felt hints of this before. A decision you made years ago suddenly reveals consequences that feel impossibly aligned, as if the future had been whispering to the past, nudging you toward the version of yourself you needed to become. Or you sense that a choice you're about to make carries weight far beyond the moment, a kind of branching, where one direction feels heavy or stagnant and another feels alive. Even if you can't explain why, these aren't accidents. They're glimpses of the multidimensional nature of time. Some interpretations of quantum theory propose that all possibilities exist in superposition until an observation locks one into place. Mystical traditions echo this by saying all moments exist at once, layered like pages in a book you're already inside. Neuroscience adds its own perspective, suggesting the brain might be predicting the next moment so quickly that the experience of now becomes more fluid than you realize. Different lenses, same insight. Time may not be a straight line, it may be a field. And within that field, your choices act like selectors. Imagine standing at the center of a sphere rather than the tip of a line. Every direction around you represents a different timeline, not in the science fiction sense of alternate universes, but as potential trajectories your life could unfold into. The direction you end up walking is determined not just by what you want, but by the frequency you're holding when you choose. When you're aligned, you sense the path that leads to expansion. When you're in fear, you feel pulled toward contraction. The options are always there, but the version of you doing the choosing determines which path lights up. This is why certain decisions feel strangely familiar, as if you've already experienced their consequences. It's not déjà vu, it's resonance with the timeline that matches your state of being. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Sometimes a future version of you, one you haven't lived yet, but already exists in the field of possibility, sends a kind of subtle signal backward, a nudge, a knowing, a magnetic pull toward a specific choice. Mystics call this intuition. Some physicists speculate about retrocausality. Psychologists might call it subconscious processing. Whatever label you place on it, the experience is undeniable. Something in you knows before you know. You've likely felt moments where time seemed to stretch or compress conversations that lasted minutes but felt like hours, or experiences that consumed hours but vanished like a breath. These distortions often happen when you brush against the boundary between timelines, when the present moment rises so fully into awareness that it no longer behaves like a tiny dividing line between past and future. In that heightened state, you're not moving through time, you're selecting from it. This isn't about controlling destiny, it's about recognizing that the architecture of possibility surrounds you in every direction, and your state of consciousness determines which path becomes real for you. Your choices aren't isolated events, they're alignments. Each decision shifts the trajectory. Each moment of clarity nudges you toward a timeline where more clarity awaits. Each moment of contraction draws you toward a timeline where contraction repeats until it is understood. And the astonishing part is this: you're already feeling the pull of your next timeline right now. That subtle hum in your awareness, that quiet sense of momentum gathering beneath your thoughts. It's the field rearranging itself as your frequency adjusts. Your future is not approaching from a distance. It's forming around you as you shift into the version of yourself who can live it. In the next section, we'll walk deeper into this idea of identity, not the story you've been handed, but the field configuration you're becoming. That quiet pull you felt at the end of the last section, that sense of stepping toward a version of yourself you haven't fully met, is the perfect bridge into the next layer of this journey. Because as timelines shift around your choices, something else begins to shift within you. The version of you that once felt solid starts to feel more fluid, more transparent, more spacious than you ever imagined. It's here that identity itself begins to loosen, not in a dramatic unraveling, but in the gentle realization that the self you've been carrying all these years might be less of a fixed structure and more of a temporary pattern, a stable-looking whirl in a river that is always moving. Most people never question this pattern. They inherit a story, reinforce it through habit, protect it with familiar thoughts, and assume that's who they are. But the moment you begin interacting with timelines from a deeper frequency, the boundaries of that old identity start to show their seams. You might feel this as distance, like you're watching yourself act in familiar ways, yet you're no longer fully convinced those actions belong to the truest version of you. Or it may arise as a strange clarity during quiet moments, where your thoughts don't feel like your thoughts, but like patterns passing through a wider field of awareness. These moments aren't signs of disorientation. They're signs of awakening. Consider the possibility that your identity is not a single unit, but a frequency configuration, a pattern of beliefs, emotions, memories, reactions, and narratives held together by attention. When your attention shifts, the configuration begins to dissolve, making room for a wider expression of consciousness to come through. Think of it like moving between floors of the architecture we explored earlier. On one level, the self feels like a solid room, personal history, preferences, wounds, triumphs, but step through an invisible boundary, and that same room looks different, more spacious, more permeable, less authoritative. The walls that once felt permanent now feel symbolic, like scenery rather than confinement. This is identity dissolution, and it doesn't mean losing yourself. It means seeing through the version of yourself that was never whole to begin with. Some contemplative traditions describe this as the loosening of the ego, the softening of the narrative self. Neuroscientists talk about shifts in self-referential processing, where the brain's habitual storytelling quiets, allowing awareness to perceive reality without filtering it through personal history. Mystics simply say the mask begins to slip. Whatever the language, the experience is unmistakable. You begin to witness yourself instead of being trapped inside yourself. This is where freedom begins. Because once you no longer believe every thought you think, you're no longer compelled to react to every storyline your mind presents. The internal chatter that once defined your identity becomes background noise, and you realize you can choose which threads to follow and which to release. This creates space for a deeper identity, not the one built from biography, but the one built from awareness itself. You may notice moments where presence feels more you than your personality, where silence feels more authentic than your opinions, where compassion arises unprovoked, as if it belongs to a broader consciousness rather than your personal character. These aren't anomalies. They're previews. As your identity dissolves, what's left isn't emptiness, it's spaciousness. It's the realization that you can shift states of being the way you shift perspectives. You're not losing yourself. You're expanding beyond the narrow configuration that once felt like the whole story. This transition can feel like standing between two versions of yourself, the familiar one built from past experience and the emerging one shaped by possibility. You haven't left the old self behind, but you're no longer confined to it. It sits beside you like a costume you can step into when needed, rather than a cage that dictates every move. And once you experience this fluidity even once, it becomes harder to believe that the old identity was ever the full truth. Because the more you dissolve, the more you sense the deeper self rising, the one that isn't defined by timeline, circumstance, or conditioning, but by presence itself. In the next section, we'll explore how to recognize the unmistakable markers that show you're operating from this expanded state, not as theory, but as lived experience. As the old identity loosens its grip and that deeper, more spacious version of you begins to rise, something else becomes noticeable, a set of unmistakable signals revealing that you're no longer operating from the narrow confines of the former self. The transition from identity as costume to identity as consciousness is subtle at first, but once it stabilizes, the signs are impossible to miss. And the shift you felt in the last section, that sensation of witnessing yourself instead of being trapped inside your old patterns, is the perfect doorway into understanding these markers. Because once you begin perceiving yourself as something wider than your biography, reality begins responding accordingly. Let's walk through the markers that often appear when someone starts living from this expanded frequency rather than merely visiting it. The first marker is acceleration, not of pace, but of alignment. Events begin to cluster with a kind of quiet intelligence. Thoughts you once dismissed as whims turn out to be previews. Desires you once believed would take years start finding pathways toward you with surprising efficiency. It's not that you're controlling outcomes, it's that you're operating from a state where resistance has softened, allowing possibilities to cohere faster. The world hasn't sped up. Your access to potential has widened. The second marker is synchronicity, shifting from novelty to navigation. Instead of seeing synchronicities as coincidences, you begin recognizing them as signals, gentle course corrections that nudge you toward the timeline that matches your current frequency. A number pattern appears right as you consider a difficult choice. You overhear a sentence that answers a question you didn't speak aloud. People show up at the exact moment your inner state reaches a point of readiness. These aren't messages from outside you. They're reflections from the field you're co-creating. The third marker is what many describe as intuitive knowing, not guesswork, not hope, but a kind of internal clarity that arises without effort. You suddenly know something without having thought it through, as if the information didn't travel to you but appeared fully formed. It feels like guidance, but not from a voice or an image, more like a shift in gravity pulling you toward the next right step. Psychology calls it subconscious pattern recognition. Mystics call it inner guidance. You experience it as undeniable. The fourth marker is emotional sovereignty, not emotional numbness sovereignty. Situations that used to trigger you no longer hijack your system. You feel emotions deeply, but you don't drown in them. You sense anger without becoming it. You feel sadness without collapsing into it. You experience joy without clinging to it. This is what happens when identity dissolves. Emotions stop being authorities and become visitors. You greet each one with clarity, compassion, and presence, and they pass through more cleanly because of it. The fifth marker is the softening of external pressure. Life still brings challenges, but the texture of those challenges shifts. Instead of feeling like you're pushing against a hostile world, you sense that the world is reorganizing itself to match the frequency you hold. Obstacles become information rather than punishment. Setbacks redirect rather than defeat. It's not easier. It's more congruent. The sixth marker is perceptual depth, a widening of the way you take in the world. Colors seem richer. Silence feels fuller. Music carries layers you never heard before. People's emotions are more visible even when unspoken. Your own thoughts feel more transparent, less sticky. You've stepped into a deeper chamber of the architecture, and everything reflects that depth back to you. The seventh marker is coherence, Your thoughts, feelings, words, and actions begin to align without force. You say what you mean, you feel what you feel. You act from clarity instead of fear. You stop performing and start expressing. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop fracturing your attention. You stop abandoning your own truth. Coherence is not perfection, it's integrity of frequency. It's you becoming one whole movement instead of many conflicting fragments. And the final marker, the one that confirms you've crossed a real inner threshold, is recognition of consciousness in others. You no longer see only the personality in front of you. You sense the awareness behind their eyes. You feel the field they're moving through. Judgment dissolves because you're no longer relating to surface-level behavior, but to the deeper essence animating it. You're seeing from the quantum state, not toward it. These markers aren't achievements. They're evidence. They show you've shifted from the narrow identity into the wider field. And now that you can recognize them, you're ready to explore how to stabilize them, how to live in the quantum zone, not as a visitor, but as a native. The moment you recognize those markers in yourself, the coherence, the synchronicities, the intuitive clarity, the emotional steadiness, you may feel something subtle rising in the background. It's a kind of inner question, unspoken but unmistakable. How do I stay here? How do I deepen this? How do I keep from slipping back into the smaller chambers of the architecture? That question is the perfect bridge into this next terrain. Because the quantum state isn't a peak to maintain by force. It's a frequency you learn to return to, again and again, until it becomes natural, just as you sensed identity dissolving into a wider field. These stabilizing codes aren't techniques you perform. They're ways of relating to experience that help you stay aligned with the expanded version of yourself. Let's step into them gently. The first frequency code is present moment totality, not simply being present, but recognizing that the present is the only place anything actually happens. Past and future still appear as thoughts, but you begin to sense they're both currents flowing into the now. Memories arise now, anticipations arise now. Regret and hope both happen here. This is the anchor that keeps you from drifting back into the old identity. When you return to the now, you return to coherence. The second code is awareness as refuge. Instead of reacting from the story your mind offers, you drop into the part of you that sees the story. When tension arises, you rest as the one who notices the tension. When doubt appears, you rest as the one witnessing the doubt. This is where the architecture becomes stable beneath your feet. Awareness is the one chamber you can always stand in, even when everything else shifts. It doesn't require effort. It simply requires remembering to rest in the place that has never been disturbed. The third code is intentional frequency generation. This isn't about forcing yourself into fake positivity. It's about choosing the inner tone you want to broadcast, independent of external circumstance. Gratitude without justification. Calm without conditions. Love without narrative. Appreciation without needing a reason. When you generate frequency deliberately, the architecture reorganizes around you more quickly, not because you're manipulating reality, but because coherence attracts coherence. The fourth code is fresh observation. Every moment contains infinite possibilities, but you only see the ones your perception filters allow. Most people observe the world through the lens of their past, repeating the same interpretations, predicting the same outcomes, assuming the same limitations. But when you look at the present moment as if it's brand new, with no past projected onto it, the world reveals pathways that weren't visible before. Fresh observation collapses fresh possibilities. The fifth code is energetic coherence. Your inner reality becomes stable when your thoughts, emotions, words, and actions move in the same direction. When any of these contradict the others, you feel fragmented. But when they align, even imperfectly, they create a ripple of stability that moves through the field around you. Coherence isn't about never wavering. It's about noticing misalignment quickly and gently, realigning without judgment. The sixth code is quiet surrender to timing. In the quantum state, impatience collapses possibility prematurely. But surrender, not resignation, not passivity, but a calm willingness to let timing unfold, keeps the field open. It prevents you from forcing outcomes that weren't ready and allows deeper pathways to reveal themselves. When you surrender timing, reality stops resisting you. It starts partnering with you. The seventh code is inner spaciousness. This isn't abstract. It's literal in your experience. You pause. You breathe. You allow emotion to arise without tightening around it. You let your awareness expand outward and inward simultaneously, as if the boundaries of your inner world dissolve into a wider field. This spaciousness is the atmosphere of the quantum zone. When you remember it, you return to it. The eighth code, perhaps the most important, is gentle returning. You will forget. You will contract. You will slip into old patterns. But the quantum state doesn't demand constancy. It invites remembering. Every time you notice you've fallen out of coherence and you return even through a single breath, you strengthen the circuitry that makes the state easier to access. Returning is the practice. Returning is the path. Returning is the stabilization, not perfection, reorientation. And when these codes become familiar, when you begin to move through them naturally, you're no longer trying to hold the quantum zone. You're living from it. Which leads us into the next revelation, the one where all these practices open into something even larger, a direct encounter with the unified field that underlies every timeline, every identity, and every experience you've ever had. You might have noticed, as those stabilizing codes settled into you, that something quieter began forming underneath them, a question you didn't ask out loud, yet it keeps humming in the background. If these states are available because of coherence, then what exactly is coherence aligning me with? What is the larger intelligence beneath all this? That subtle curiosity is your bridge into this next chamber. Because once you stabilize in the quantum state, even for brief moments, a deeper recognition begins to glow around the edges of your awareness. The sense that everything you're experiencing is happening inside a single, interconnected field. The synchronicities, the clarity, the intuitive pull, the dissolving of identity, the returning to presence. All of it begins pointing toward the same quiet truth. You're not moving through a world made of separate things. You're moving through a field expressing itself through countless forms. Let's ease into this gently. Imagine the architecture we've explored so far, the chambers, the thresholds, the frequencies not as a structure you're walking inside, but as something arising within a larger medium, like patterns inside water, like currents inside air, like waves inside an ocean. The forms appear distinct, but they're made of the same substance. This is the unified field, not as a scientific doctrine, but as a lived perception. Some physicists attempt to describe the universe as a seamless web of energy and probability. Mystics describe the same reality as oneness appearing as multiplicity. Neuroscientists speak of perception emerging from integrated networks that dissolve the boundary between self and world. Different explanations, same direction. When your consciousness stabilizes, you begin sensing this unity not as philosophy, but as texture. You look at someone's eyes and feel the awareness behind them resonating with the awareness behind your own. You hear a sound and feel it ripple through you instead of arriving from out there. You sit in silence and the silence feels shared, not personal, not private, but communal. like the whole field is breathing with you. This is where the paradox begins to unfold, because as unity becomes more familiar, your individuality doesn't dissolve. Instead, it becomes clearer. You feel more yourself than ever, but that self no longer feels isolated. It feels like a unique angle through which the field experiences itself. A wave doesn't stop being a wave when it recognizes it's the ocean. It becomes a truer wave, one that moves with the ocean's intelligence rather than against it. This paradox, individuality within unity. Unity within individuality is the signature of the quantum zone. The mind trained in linear thinking often struggles with this. It wants the truth to be one thing or the other. Either you are separate or you are one. Either you have a personal identity or you dissolve into cosmic consciousness. But the quantum state isn't binary. It holds both truths at once, and neither contradicts the other. You are a localized expression of the field, and you are the field expressing itself locally. Both are true. Both are happening. Both are you. As this recognition deepens, something remarkable begins to shift in how you relate to the world. Judgment softens because separation softens. You no longer react to people's behaviors as if they are foreign obstacles. Instead, you feel the shared field underneath their actions. You sense the same awareness looking out of their eyes that looks out of yours, even if they're not conscious of it. Compassion stops being a virtue and becomes a natural response. You also stop taking your own thoughts so seriously, not because they're meaningless, but because you no longer mistake them for the whole you. They're ripples inside the field, nothing more movements of energy, expressions of inner weather, passing patterns rather than permanent truths. And when you see through your thoughts, you start seeing through everyone's. This is not detachment, it's clarity. It's the clarity that comes from recognizing that the many forms you encounter are all expressions of the same underlying essence, a single presence flowing through billions of temporary configurations. When this becomes lived truth, not just theory, life transforms. The world feels less sharp, conflict feels less personal, connection feels inevitable. You're not dissolving into nothing. You're remembering you were never separate from anything. And from this recognition, a new kind of responsibility begins to form, not imposed, but felt, because every shift in your frequency ripples through the entire field. That's where we go next. As the sense of unity settles into your awareness, that quiet recognition that you're both the wave and the ocean, something else begins to shimmer at the edges of perception. You may feel it almost like a subtle tug, a sense that your inner state isn't just shaping your personal experience. It seems to influence the atmosphere around you, as if your frequency is no longer confined to your own skin. That feeling is your doorway into the next realization. What shifts in you ripples through the entire field. The unified field doesn't only reveal that everything is connected, it also reveals that everything is responsive. And the moment you begin to live from this recognition, you start noticing how your coherence, your clarity, your groundedness, your presence begins affecting others even before any words are exchanged. Think about times in your life when simply being near someone changed your state. A calm person steadies the room, a frantic person amplifies tension. A joyful person lifts the atmosphere without trying. This isn't metaphor, it's resonance. Your nervous system, your emotional body, your attention, all of it participates in a kind of field-level communication that happens beneath language. As your awareness stabilizes in the quantum state, this sensitivity heightens. You begin to feel the subtle emotional weather around you, and you notice that when your internal state shifts, the environment shifts with it. A conversation changes tone, a tense space loosens. People open or soften or find clarity without knowing why. You're not controlling anything. You're harmonizing the field simply by being coherent within yourself. Some interpretations of biology describe this as entrainment systems, aligning with the strongest or most stable rhythm in their vicinity. Others refer to morphic resonance, where once a pattern becomes established, it becomes easier for others to access. Psychology describes emotional contagion. Spiritual traditions call it transmission. Different frameworks, same underlying pattern. Your state creates a ripple that others feel, even if they can't articulate it. And as your state stabilizes, the ripples become more consistent. This is not about performing peace or pretending enlightenment. It's about the natural influence of genuine coherence. When you are clear, people feel clearer around you. When you are grounded, others settle without knowing why. When you operate from presence, the field around you remembers presence too. You begin to function like a tuning fork inside the collective. And here's where this becomes even more profound. The ripple doesn't stop with the people physically near you. Awareness doesn't respect spatial boundaries the way the rational mind assumes it does. Anyone you think about, anyone you feel for, anyone you hold in your attention even briefly becomes part of the resonance exchange. You've likely felt this before you think of someone, and they reach out within hours. You shift your perspective, and the dynamic with someone else shifts almost instantly. These aren't coincidences, these are field-level interactions. The more coherent your frequency, the further the ripple travels. This is why personal evolution has always been tied to collective evolution. Not because awakened individuals act as teachers or leaders, though some do, but because every person who stabilizes in deeper awareness makes that awareness more accessible to everyone else. Even without words, awakening ripples sideways, not just upward. And we are living in a moment where these ripples are becoming more frequent, more concentrated, more potent. More people are sensing these boundaries. More people are crossing them. More people are noticing reality respond in ways that feel orchestrated rather than random. You're part of this momentum, not a follower inside it, a contributor to it. Your presence in the quantum state doesn't lift others through force. It lifts them through resonance. It offers a frequency the field can align with. It creates openings where none seem possible. It turns scattered attention into coherence. It softens conflict, deepens honesty, and strengthens intuition in ways the mind alone could never accomplish. This isn't responsibility. It's participation. You're participating in a collective shift every time you choose awareness over reactivity, coherence over fragmentation, presence over narrative. And those choices accumulate. They form patterns. They strengthen pathways. They build momentum in the collective unconscious. This is how the unified field evolves, not in dramatic upheavals, but in quiet, steady recalibrations that happen through individuals who remember what they are. And as these ripples deepen, you may begin to feel another rhythm emerging beneath it all, a rhythm that doesn't just expand outward into the collective, but circles back into your own life in waves of forgetting and remembering. That rhythm is where we go next. As those ripples through the collective field settle into your awareness, you may feel a deeper rhythm surfacing beneath them, something quieter, more intimate, almost like the pulse of your own evolution echoing back to you. In Section 9, you saw how your frequency influences the world around you. But if you listen closely, you'll notice something else. The field also influences you, not by pulling you backward, but by inviting you into a rhythm every awakened consciousness eventually learns to recognize. It is the rhythm of forgetting and remembering. And this rhythm is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. You might have moments when the unified field feels close enough to touch, when coherence feels effortless, when synchronicity flows like breath. Then, hours or days later, you find yourself pulled back into old habits, reacting from old wounds, collapsing into thoughts you believed you had outgrown. It can feel like losing progress, but it isn't. Forgetting is not regression. Forgetting is integration. Look carefully at your own experience every time you forget. The remembering that follows is deeper than the one before. Every return carries more clarity, more stability, more understanding. You're not circling in place, you're spiraling upward, each loop carrying you into a wider, more grounded version of yourself. This spiral is the architecture of awakening. Ancient traditions hinted at this long before modern psychology explored it. Zen teachers spoke of sudden insight, followed by long stretches of ordinary mind. Sufi mystics described veils lifting and descending again as consciousness acclimates to light. Even neuroscience observes that transformation happens in oscillation cycles of heightened awareness followed by consolidation. Different metaphors, same pattern. You wake up, you forget. You wake up deeper. You forget softer. You wake up wider. The forgetting becomes less dramatic because the remembering becomes more natural. This rhythm is especially important once you begin to sense the unified field. At first, unity feels transcendent. You touch it and everything feels clear. But as you move through daily life, the small self reasserts itself through old stories, familiar emotions, social conditioning. It's not trying to sabotage you. It's trying to keep you safe in a world it learned to navigate by contraction. Your job isn't to eliminate the small self. It's to help it relax inside a larger truth. And nothing does that more effectively than meeting your own forgetting with gentleness instead of judgment. When you judge yourself for slipping, you collapse your frequency into the very contraction you're trying to transcend. When you greet forgetting with presence. Here is the old pattern again. You transform the contraction into a doorway. You turn falling asleep into a cue to wake up softer. This is the moment your spiritual maturity begins to crystallize. Because anyone can stay coherent on a mountaintop moment, a peak experience, a transmission that lifts them temporarily. But stabilizing in the quantum state requires something else, the willingness to return again and again, with patience, with breath, with compassion. Each return strengthens the neural pathways of awareness. Each return deepens your trust in the field. Each return loosens the grip of the old identity. Eventually, the returning becomes so effortless that forgetting no longer scares you. You know you'll find your way back. You know the architecture is still here. You know coherence isn't something you hold. It's something you fall into when the resistance collapses. And that collapse becomes more frequent, more natural, more organic. This is when your awakening becomes embodied. Not a flash of insight, but a lived orientation. Not a single breakthrough, but an ongoing relationship with your own consciousness. You stop chasing peak states and start trusting the quiet intelligence moving through you. Life stops being a test and becomes a training ground. Challenges stop being threats and become invitations to return to presence. This is the deep turning of the spiral, where remembering becomes not an event, but a rhythm you move with. And when you sense that rhythm, you realize something profound. You're not awakening alone. You're awakening as part of the field. Your forgetting is part of the collective forgetting. Your remembering contributes to the collective remembering. Your spiral intertwines with countless others rising alongside you. The field moves through you as much as you move through it. And sensing this prepares you for what comes next. The gentle landing, the quiet integration, the soft closing arc that helps everything you've learned settle into your system in a way that stays with you long after these words fade. you can still feel the echo of that spiral. Can't you? The soft rise and fall of forgetting and remembering, the gentle motion of a consciousness learning to trust its own depth. That rhythm doesn't leave you when the words end. It lingers, like a tide that continues to move long after the moon has shifted position. And that lingering rhythm becomes the landing place for everything we've explored together. Take a moment to notice how your awareness feels now, not to analyze it, but to sense the texture of it. There's a spaciousness that wasn't as strong before, a steadiness, a quiet confidence in the background, even if you're not fully sure where it came from. That's what integration feels like when it begins, not a flash of insight, but the settling of clarity into the body. This is the place where the quantum zone stops feeling like an idea and starts feeling like a presence. Not dramatic, not loud, just a subtle resonance you can return to whenever you're ready. The same way breath is always available. Awareness is always available. You fall away, you return. And each return strengthens your connection to the deeper field you've been sensing all along. You don't need to hold on to anything from this journey. Nothing needs to be memorized or grasped. What stays with you will stay naturally, the way a tone continues vibrating after the instrument has gone quiet. The rest will fade in the way all unneeded teachings fade, gently, without loss. If you feel a subtle pull to continue exploring these territories, trust that, not as obligation, but as resonance. Your system knows when something aligns with its evolution. It knows when a frequency serves your next step. If this transmission felt like a match, you may choose to return to this space, to this channel, whenever the next layer calls. For now, breathe once more, feel the ground beneath you, sense the field around you. Let the spiral continue moving in its own timing. You haven't stepped away from the quantum zone. You're simply learning to recognize that it walks with you.